My name is Lulan Yu. I'm the Education Programs Manager at the museum, and I will turn it right over to Sarah.
Thanks, Lulan. So thank you all for attending. I have been at the VMFA for a year now as in a new position, really. It's the first official photography curator, as well as director of the Raysor Center. But I am also sitting on top of the shoulders of giants, of many people who've built the collection over the last 90 or so years. And in fact, what inspired this show, and since you're not there physically, I'll give you a little view of it. This was my first installation at the museum, and it was inspired by looking at the history of photography at VMFA. I thought I better get to know the collection, so I decided to start looking at what the museum had acquired from the start to now. And I was thrilled to discover that among the very first acquisitions that the museum made in 1936, the year it opened its doors to the public, was a group of 159 photographs by Francis Benjamin Johnston, a leading photojournalist and photographer of the day. And this was really surprising to me because, I didn't think that I'd find photography embedded really in the very earliest moments of the museum, but even more so that the museum exhibited those photographs that year to great acclaim. So it was interesting for me to pull these out, and then I was even more stunned when I saw them. As you'll see in a minute, they're incredibly beautiful. But I didn't want to just look back at the past. I also thought I wanted to think about how this founding moment, this founding collection has grown over the years, how we can, from our vantage point now, both continue to build our collection looking forward, but make sure that we have connections to the past. So this installation pairs the work of two artists. One of them, Francis Benjamin Johnston, who is on the left of the screen, the first photographer in our collection. And on the right, Keris, Salmon, a contemporary artist whose work came in 2021. So it was one of the most recent acquisitions paired with one of the earliest. And there are a lot of connections between their work, which we'll explore today. And so that was sort of a really exciting thing for me to discover, is to see both the connections between the work we were acquiring 80 years ago and the work we're acquiring now, but also to think about the way that we see these works differently. I'm going to start by showing you a little bit of work by Johnston, but first I want to tell you about her life, because she is a remarkable woman and photographer. And I thought I'd start by showing you two of her self-portraits, because you can see she really styles herself as what was called in the early 20th century, the new woman. She was actually born in 1864 in West Virginia, but grew up in Washington, D.C., where her mother was a leading journalist of the day, one of the first women actually to be an international correspondent. So Johnston grew up in an educated, international household where lots of different luminaries passed through. She actually studied art for a little while in France at Académie Julienne, one of the French art schools that admitted women at the time. But when she returned to the United States, she decided to become a journalist. However, she found that if she had pictures with her stories, they would sell better. And she had learned photography as a teenager, supposedly from George Eastman himself, the founder of Kodak. Regardless of whether that's true or not, by the 1880s, she was making pictures for a living. The picture you see of her on the left is showing her cross-dressing and with a bicycle. So these are two sort of signs of what the new woman was at that time: independent, getting around with the transportation that was a symbol of women's freedom. And on the right, you see her perhaps in more conventional wear, but if you look closely, you see that she's holding a cigarette or cigar, a beer stein, and she is very deliberately showing her ankles. So she is thumbing her nose at convention. This is also in her own home or studio. And you see on top of the mantelpiece, those are a lot of photographs that she herself made. So Johnston started out as a portrait photographer and journalist, which took her all around the world. And then in about 1909, she moved to New York and she opened up an architectural photography studio with her romantic partner, Maddie Edwards Hewitt. And they ran that studio for some time. When their relationship crumbled, she moved back to Washington, D.C. But that experience as an architectural photographer would be really important for her, for the body of work that she did in the 1930s. That is also the body of work she made for that is now in our collection here. So in the late 1920s, Johnston, who by this time had done journalism, portrait photography, she had actually undertaken several commissions to photograph what are now historically Black colleges and universities, both Hampton and Tuskegee. She had shown those works with W.E.B. Du Bois in Paris at 1900. In 1900, there was a major, what was called the World's Fair, a universal exhibition. At that same exhibition, she actually curated one of the earliest shows I know of women photographers. So she really is groundbreaking in many ways. By the 1920s, she gets a commission, first private, to photograph historic architecture in Virginia. And this private commission leads to a 20-year project in which she photographs, eventually, she makes over 8,000 negatives in 9 states in the South, and it becomes what's known as the Carnegie Survey of Architecture in the South. It's created primarily in the 1930s, and it is really documenting all kinds of architecture, both sort of high styles, well-known buildings, but also vernacular architecture in the South. And you see her here. She's actually in North Carolina in this photograph. And I want you to note both, the size of her camera, especially in comparison to her relative age. She continued the survey in her 70s. And then also the gentleman on the left up front, that is Huntley Ruff, and that was her assistant throughout almost the entirety of this project. And which she continued for almost 20 years. She had to stop right around World War II because of both her age, but also the lack of access to materials, including gasoline and photographic supplies. Now, I've had a lot of questions about Huntley's role in this project. Certainly, as you can see, this is the car they drove around in. He was the driver. He helped carry a lot of the equipment. If we go back to this picture, you can see that Johnston is actually using a large format camera on a tripod. And this is because this allowed her to get the highest detailed, highest quality negatives. And it tends to be used for architectural photography because you can also kind of control the plane of the camera in different ways with the angle of architecture. But it's not an easy camera to use. The shots take a long time to set up and requires a lot of heavy equipment. One of the questions that was raised for me was what the experience was like for Mr. Ruff, who was driving around segregated Virginia in the 30s and early 40s with Johnston. And I thought a lot about the questions of, where did they eat? Where did they sleep? Could they eat at the same restaurants? Could they sleep at the same hotels? I don't think so. So a lot more research deserves to be done on their relationship, and in particular, his role in aiding her and taking her pictures. One thing we do know about Johnston, though, was that she was determined to get any shot she could, and she was very, very particular. In order to make pictures such as this one, she would first have to find the site, and there was not a register of National Historic Places at this moment, although her work was part of a growing interest in documenting historic architecture and architecture in the South. In particular, there was a real interest in the 20s and 30s of preserving colonial architecture. There was a sense that, you know, and particularly in the South, a lot of buildings had been left to neglect and ruin. And many of these were sort of some of the earliest examples of colonial architecture in Virginia. And in fact, this picture, which is called it's just the building is called Little England, is an example of some of this early architecture. This was built, the land that it's on, which is overlooking the York River, was deeded in 1651, and this house was built in about 1716. And supposedly it was built on plans that were designed by the great English architect, Sir Christopher Wren, which is probably why it's called Little England. The house has a storied history. It was used as a lookout for ships during the Battle of Yorktown. It's in the Georgian style. And in fact, the house was restored in 1939. So several years after Johnston made her picture. And her architectural survey was, as I said, part of this larger kind of interest in preserving architecture in the United States, and an interest not just in high and important houses, but also in vernacular buildings and dwellings, as we shall see. One of the other fascinating things I learned about Johnston in doing research on these pictures is that she also, through these pictures, founded the picture collection at the Library of Congress, because she wrote to the librarian at some point and said, I've been taking all these pictures. These would be good historical records for your library, and I think you should preserve them. And then she sent her negatives and some pictures, and they now house all the negatives for this survey. And then after that, they started collecting pictures, you know, from other kinds of endeavors, and now they have one of the largest photograph collections in the United States. But the other thing that is so wonderful about Johnston's pictures, and I know that you're at home, so you can't see the size of these, she chose to make these as really beautiful enlargements. And there's wonderful correspondence in the archives of the museum where she's writing to the first museum director, praising him for deciding to spend a little extra on the enlarged picture. So these are about, 16 by 20 inches, which in contemporary photography is not that large, but this time they were. And they have a remarkable clarity, a beautiful printing, but also I think you can see from this picture, they're very carefully composed. The way that that gate on the left is just sort of perfectly open, our eye travels through the picture. That center part of the building is right in the middle of the picture. And even the way that we have the two trees framing on left and right, none of this is by accident. And in fact, Johnston was known for having trees removed if they were in the way of an important shot, or vines taken off, or building roads to get somewhere. She was really determined to get a picture at any price. And within these photographs, you see her also merging the interest in architectural history with a real desire to make beautiful pictures. Pictures that are also part of a larger aesthetic around landscape. This is a photograph of what was called Upshur Hall, or Old Upshur Hall. And this was built originally in 1691, although this building probably dates to later, on a parcel of land in Northampton County. And there was originally a house built by John Upshur, and then as the family expanded and their holdings of enslaved people expanded, they built another house, and the original house became the housing for enslaved workers. And that's the other aspect of this exhibition that was also fascinating to me. I worked with a wonderful intern, Ajana Bradshaw, who's a grad student at VCU. And when we began looking at the pictures of all the noted buildings, I asked her, well, see what research you can do and perhaps the relationship of the families to the buildings and relationship to slavery. And it was not just one or two, it was really almost every single kind of major piece of land also was the site of slave owning. And that really was not something that is brought out, of course, by Johnston at the time, but really relates to some of the more contemporary photographs we have in this show. But Johnston was very aware of the racial dynamics and the segregation in the South. And that comes across in many of her pictures. This is a wonderful and intriguing work called Old Tavern. It's on Brook Road in Richmond. And it's a little hard to see in your screen at home. So I do hope you get to the museum to study these pictures in detail. But what we see up front is a line of children, all African American, and they're all looking off at something else, except for one of the children who looks directly at the photographer. But they're lined up looking at something else, some spectacle, we're not sure. And then behind them are two white gentlemen conversing, and they're proprietor of a store, and you see the goods outside of it. And this picture, perhaps it's a picture of the tavern for historical purposes, but Johnston's interest here clearly is in the social dynamics and in particular the children. But also she's kind of visualizing this literally here, a kind of segregation of Black and white, even within the same intimate space. And then, other pictures like this is our old cabins, Fredericksburg. We do know that she made photographs of very modest homes, including former dwellings that housed enslaved people. And she really sought out children in particular, but individuals when she could, who would obviously have to pose in front of in the photographs. The time it took her to compose her photographs, the time and the exposure required that these children pose. There's no snapshots here, and they're doing their job very, very well. But if you look carefully too, you see these three young children in front, all African American, and in the background, sitting on the steps, is sort of a middle-aged white woman. And it sort of raises the question of, what was Johnston's intention here? What is the relationship? And what is the relationship to the architecture? And I don't have great answers, but I do think that she is trying to make an argument that we don't preserve architecture just because it's a relic of the past, but because it also continues to shape the present. And she was very aware of issues around race and poverty with her work with Du Bois. And I think that, she's trying to bring attention to some of the issues around poverty and segregation in the South, but do so in a way that was also acceptable to her sponsors, the Carnegie Corporation, who essentially funded her on this mission. These issues within her work, I think, are drawn out and sort of complemented nicely by the work of Keris Salmon, who's the contemporary artist we've paired with Francis Benjamin Johnston in this display. And Salmon has a different history than Johnston, but a lot of overlaps as well. Until she really turned to photography full-time in about 2012, Keris Salmon was a working journalist. She worked in print, video, television, but her primary career was journalism. And she turned to photography full-time around 2012. And her use of photography as a creative and conceptual medium was really sparked by a personal experience she had visiting Wessington Plantation in Tennessee. And it was one of the largest plantations in that state. It was a tobacco plantation, and at one point had over 500, I think 500 enslaved people laboring on the plantation. And she visited the plantation with her then boyfriend, now husband, Frank, who was a direct descendant of the plantation's original owners. And Salmon is a woman of color, African American with West Indian descent, and her husband is descendant of white Southern slaveholders. So that cognitive dissonance really got her to think about what the day-to-day life of enslaved people might have been like on these plantations and these historic homes, but also to think about the very strange conjunction of sort of intimacy, domesticity, and yet a systematic violence and oppression, and the way that these two things knitted together. And I think that comes across in just the title of this series, which is called To Have and to Hold. And that title comes from documents that relate to Barbersville, which is what you see, the ruins of Barbersville is what you see in this picture. Virginia Governor James Barber actually wrote a will to his daughter, bequeathing her 32 human beings, naming them all, to have and to hold. And while that seems like almost like a romantic or a marriage contract, to have and to hold in this sense cemented legal ownership. So this is what Keris Salmon is really exploring in these photographs. Now I say photographs, but I think as you can see, they're actually photographs that have been printed onto beautiful thick paper with letterpress words on them, fragments. And these are all drawn from historic sources that relate to whatever site she was photographing. She's a journalist, so she likes to do her research. So these come sometimes from published sources and letters, slave registers, diaries, and so forth. So for all of the works in this series, and I think there are 12 total, she has done particular research and paired a text with an image. It's not always clear where the text comes from and who might be speaking, and that's part of her intention too, is to bring out the different sort of polyphonic nature of the experience of slavery in the United States. I think about this picture too. It's a very beautiful, quiet picture, just of a sort of set of silver gleaming in the light. But the text relates to preparing a meal for the British. And we don't know, is it the person who ran the household? Is it one of the enslaved workers? But it makes us think about all the labor that went into maintaining a household. And I think one of the most fascinating stories within this series is the photographs that Salmon made at Montpelier, Virginia, the home of Madison. And in it, she really brings to life the voice of Paul Jennings, who was Madison's enslaved manservant. And the story of Jennings is an amazing one. I couldn't cover it here, even if I had another half hour. So I encourage you all to look it up if you are interested. But essentially, he had been with the Madison family as sort of Madison's valet for many, many years. And although he had at one point, Dolly Madison had planned to free him upon her death, she ran into significant financial troubles and instead sold him. And at this point, he had his own family with 5 children and a wife. So he was, of course, terrified as to what would happen. And through a variety of networks, he eventually was purchased by the abolitionist and statesman Daniel Webster. And Webster then agreed to free him, but even then Jennings had to repay him by laboring for him for $8 a month. And that is what the text you see here relates to. I have paid $120 for the freedom of Paul Jennings. He agrees to work out the same at $8 per month and to be furnished with room, clothes, washing, etc. So you pair that idea of a freedom that still has to be bought and paid for with labor with this picture, which is of an open gate. It makes me think of the first gate that we saw in the Johnston photograph. And we see the open fields beyond and a sense of possibility and freedom in this horizon, but it's also unknown. And there seems to be far at the end of the picture, yet another barrier, which I think is sort of a metaphor for the idea of, freedom, but freedom at a cost too.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you everyone for joining us. All right.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye.
Bye.